My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I will be reviewing the book Proverbs of Middle-Earth by David Rowe. This is an interesting little book. I got it for Christmas. I wasn't really sure what to expect with it because I didn't really research it before I got it, and so I didn't exactly know what I was getting myself into, but it turned out to be a really interesting read. So let's talk about kind of what I sort of expected, what I got, and things I like and don't like about the book. Before we get into the meat of things here, I need to point out, of course, that this is a corrected version of my original video, which I uploaded roughly a week ago on August the 3rd, whatever the Monday was. And the author ended up tweeting me and basically said, thanks for the review, but here's a few things I thought you got wrong. And at first I thought, I'm pretty sure I got those right, but I went back and read the book and realized he was correct. So I need to correct a few things in this video, and I also wanted to add a couple additional points just to clarify, make my point a little better. So I will pop in a couple times here to make a couple of corrections and also to kind of cement my point or otherwise clarify. And there's one other thing I wanted to point out too. So I'll be showing up again like this. So as I said, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect with this book, but I kind of expected more or less just an exploration of the different proverbs that Tolkien uses in the world of Middle-Earth and kind of an analysis of the worldview that informs the proverbs in the most general sense. Instead, it takes a slightly more specific approach, and basically the book is about using the proverbs as a way of analyzing the cultures of the people who speak them. So there's a chapter on hobbits and the proverbs they use. There's a chapter on men, well, not men generally, but like there's a chapter on Rohan, there's a chapter on Gondor. There's chapters on different cultures and basically exploring things about those cultures through the lens of the proverbs used by the people who belong to those cultures, which is a really interesting approach. I think it's definitely a worthwhile endeavor and worth taking a look at. There's always some problem with trying to overgeneralize in that sense because everybody is an individual, and you're going to have people who use proverbs that don't necessarily fit their broader culture. And he does take a sort of account of that as well, because, for example, in the Hobbit chapter, he kind of breaks hobbits down into three groups. He's got kind of the gentry, the peasants, you might say, the people like Farmer Cotton. The gentry, of course, would be the people like Baggins and, the wealthier, more well-off hobbits. And then he has a third category for the travelers, which is basically people like Merry, Pippin, Frodo, Sam, and Bilbo, who manage to go beyond the bounds of the Shire and increase their own experience with the world in a way that other hobbits just don't have, and therefore they have different types of proverbs. So he does kind of take account of that, and overall I think he does a really good job of doing this sort of approach, taking proverbs that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being cultural, but then he shows how if you look at multiple proverbs by the same person or group of people, you can see a consistent sort of ethic that really informs a given culture. So, in the Rohan chapter, there's a lot of different proverbs that are definitely distinct from, say, the Gondor chapter. And of course, the more well-off hobbits do tend to have somewhat distinct views from the poorer hobbits who have a very, very practical set of proverbs. So I think overall he does a pretty good job with it. But there are a few bones I want to pick, and some of these are small things, but some of them I think do tend to move into territory of affecting the overall thesis. So I'll kind of tell you which ones are which, but let's get into that. So for starters, and this is possibly my biggest beef with the book, is some of the things that he calls proverbs are, to me, obviously not proverbs. early in the book, he defines, or at least gives a definition of proverbs that he's basically going by for the purposes of the book, and it's a short, pithy phrase expressing some sort of wisdom that's been accepted over a period of time by a broad number of people. Essentially, is the definition. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that's more or less it. But even by his own definition, even at the broadest way that he defines it, some of the things that he calls proverbs are clearly not proverbs. Some of them are a little borderline. A borderline example might be when Merry tells Pippin after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, or rather Pippin tells Merry that we'll share a pipe as friends must in a pinch. And he turns that into a proverbs. Share pipes as friends must in a pinch. To me, that doesn't sound so much like a proverb as just, Pippin is noting the fact that they have at least one pipe that they can share, and in the situation at hand, that's just something that friends would do. That's not really a proverb to me. But some of them are strikingly obviously not proverbs. And one of the biggest examples I can think of is Elen, sila, lumenn, omentielvo. Okay, here's my first correction. In the book, he does not actually say that Elen, sila, lumenn, omentielvo is a proverb. I took it for a proverb, and the reason why is the way he often introduces proverbs, he doesn't really give them any lead up. He just kind of starts stringing them into his prose by italicizing them. He just italicizes the proverbs and just kind of weaves them into the language he's already using. He doesn't set them off with an introduction. And similarly with Elen, sila, lumenn, omentielvo, he doesn't really introduce it, but it's italicized. And so I thought it was being set off as a proverb. When he pointed out on Twitter that actually, no, I'm not using that as a proverb, I went back and reread it, and I realized he was right. What he was actually doing was what Tolkien does in the book with any Elvish phrase, which is italicize it. So the confusion was just in my mind because I had gotten so used to his, italicizing things and making clear that those were proverbs, and then just saw Elen, sila, lumenn, omentielvo and assumed that he was doing the same thing there, when in fact he was just copying Tolkien's usage. This might be something that would be worth clarifying in a further edition, just to make it clear that it's not a proverb. Maybe use a different type of formatting to set off Elvish as opposed to proverbs. But anyway, that's why I made that mistake, but definitely not the case that he's using that as a proverb. Just as a way of supporting my point, though, I would like to say another proverb that he says, which I think is clearly not a proverb. And I don't think this one gets any discussion in the main text of the book, but it is in the index where he has the huge long list of everything that he considers a proverb, and that is up the bowman, down with money bags, which is the phrase that the people of Lake Town use when they're trying to make Bard the king after he's killed the dragon Smaug. And the reason I think this is really clearly not a proverb is they could not possibly have used that phrase any time before that, so it certainly didn't obtain any wide usage. Maybe it does at some later date, but we have no indication that it does. It seems pretty clearly to be a spontaneous, one-time thing where they're basically expressing their dislike of the master of Lake Town, Moneybags, and supporting their wish to have Bard be the king now. And so it doesn't also contain really any wisdom per se, although you could argue that there is perhaps some kind of wisdom behind it, but that doesn't really seem to be what's motivating the people of Lake Town to say the phrase. At any rate, I just wanted to point out there are other fairly egregious examples, so my point doesn't disappear with the disappearance of Elen, sila, lumenn, omentielvo, so I just wanted to throw that in there. Now, that being the case, this is one of the biggest issues, but I will say that by and large, even if you exclude all the ones that are even iffy, most of his analysis still holds up. You'll still find that he can do a good job of exploring a culture through its proverbs. And so even with this, it doesn't destroy the thesis of the book. I just think it definitely detracts from the power of the book when you start throwing things in that are not proverbs. It gives you the feel that he was just reaching to find as many as he could by whatever means he could. I'm not saying that's what he was doing. I'm just saying that's the feel you get from it, because it seems like he's just cheating, trying to draw in as many as possible, when in some cases there really are very few. There are not that many elvish proverbs we run across, because we just don't get a lot of things from elves in the book. I mean, Legolas speaks a few times, and of course we see Elrond and Galadriel and Celeborn, but those are small portions of the book. We don't really see a whole lot of elves, and even less of dwarves in terms of proverbs. So I mean, he tries to pull as much as he possibly can, and some of it's just like, that's a reach. So that's the biggest problem I had with it. Let's talk about a few minor problems. Similar to thinking that some things are proverbs when they seem clearly not to be, there are also several instances where, in my opinion, he draws inferences which are not really warranted by evidence. And this doesn't mean anything about the use of proverbs per se, but for example, he says of Bilbo when discussing the section on the travelers group of the hobbits, he mentions that Bilbo probably got "the road goes ever, ever on" from elves. He also describes "the road goes ever on," that entire poem, as a lot of proverbs all kind of packed into one. Here's my second correction, and that is, he pointed out in his message to me on Twitter that maybe I was conflating "roads go ever on" with the "all that is gold does not glitter." And I went back and I found that he must be right, because he never says that "the road goes ever on" is something that Bilbo learned from elves, or that he is chock full of proverbs. He does say that latter bit about "all that is gold." Where I got the bit about him getting it from elves, I don't know. I could swear I remember reading that, and yet when I reread it, I could not find it. The only thing that I could find was a reference to the gaffer, who says, "It's an ill wind as blows nobody any good," or something to that effect. And he said that that's an import from the Elven King in The Hobbit, which in the strict sense is true, because the Elven King does use that phrase. And I think maybe what my brain did was, in the reading of it, of course, I was thinking it's not an import from the Elven King. Yes, it's borrowed from The Hobbit because Tolkien is the author of both books. But it doesn't really seem like that's something that he would have learned from the Elven King, because the gaffer would have never met the Elven King. Maybe he could have picked it up through Bilbo from the Elven King, possibly. But anyway, that's the only explanation I can come up with how I managed to create that inference in my brain, and that's completely my fault. My memory just crossed major wires, so this is just dead wrong. I will say I'm not so sure that "all that is gold does not glitter." I'm not sure that poem has all that many proverbs either. I think certainly the first line is, because it's very clearly kind of a reverse take on all that glitters isn't gold. But the other three, and this is really more my opinion than anything. It's not something that I think I could argue successfully one way or the other, because I think it's kind of up in the air. But I do think that it's kind of, the first one I think is probably a proverb, and then the next three are Bilbo's attempt to just kind of continue the theme of the proverb with similar sounding lines that could be proverbs, but don't seem to me like they would probably be in common usage as proverbs. That's just my opinion. But anyway, and just like with the earlier point with Elen, sila, lumenn, omentielvo, to throw in a different example to show that my point is not necessarily all, completely destroyed here. One other example of this that I think is valid is, he has a part of the Gondor chapter where he talks about their proverbs indicating that Gondor has this idea of exceptionalism, that Gondor sees itself as a exceptional nation of men that, is just better than everybody else, which in a sense is kind of true, less true at the end of the Third Age perhaps than at the beginning of the Second, or the beginning of the Third, I should say, because it doesn't exist at the beginning of the Second Age. Because of their descent from Numenor and all these other things, they are exceptional in a lot of ways. But he makes the point, and I think when he refers to the proverbs that Denethor uses, I think it's a very valid point that some people in Gondor really do see themselves as just kind of exceptions to human nature. For example, and not Denethor only, but also Boromir, when Boromir says, the men of Gondor don't go back on their word. I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically that idea. And yet Boromir does. They're clearly not all, that exceptional to... Now, it's... Faramir kind of uses the same language when he's talking to Frodo, and so there's a sense in which I think that's not necessarily even so much exceptionalism, but just kind of the statement of a general rule. Faramir is pointing out that one thing that the men of Minas Tirith are like, as a rule, is this, which is not to say that there are no bad men in Minas Tirith who wouldn't lie to your face. There probably are. But that's a long introduction to get around to saying he also says that Baragond uses kind of a similar line with Pippin, where he says, if we fall, who will stand? Or something like that. Basically, if Minas Tirith falls, who else in Middle-Earth will be able to stand up to resist Mordor? And think that actually is, because in that case, he's literally just pointing out, we are the strongest nation left. Rohan is not as strong as Gondor. It doesn't have as many men as Gondor. It doesn't have, it does have some fortified places like Helm's Deep and whatnot, but it's not... it's not Minas Tirith. Minas Tirith is the biggest bastion of defense left against Mordor. And if it does fall, then yeah, the rest of Middle-Earth is going to fall. And I think even in the book, you can get the idea. In the movie, it really kind of makes that clear, almost, that's true. But in the book even, I think it's kind of accepted if Gondor falls, the rest of Middle-Earth is going to fall after it because Gondor is the strongest defense left. So when he infers that Baragond and basically everybody, not literally everybody, but he seems to imply that it's a widespread belief that Gondor is being exceptional, I don't think you can draw that inference from this line by Baragond. Now, like I said before, a lot of the lines that Denethor gives, I do think you can draw that inference, but I think the point there is that Denethor thinks that way. And Gandalf rightly points out, and he points out David Rowe points out in the book that Gandalf points this out. He points out to Denethor, your want, as usual, is to think only of Gondor. Gandalf is pointing out, you're only thinking of Gondor here. I have to think of other places. It's not just Gondor that matters. Baragond is not just thinking of Gondor. He is, in fact, almost explicitly thinking of other places, but he's thinking of Gondor as kind of the prime defense against Mordor, which it is, being right next to it and being the strongest nation that's left to withstand it. Anyway, that's I just wanted to point that out to show that, again, the only example is not the one that I gave earlier. There are other examples. I guess the main point here is he's drawing inferences like this, and this is not the only instance. This is just one of the key examples, I think. And he's, making these conclusions, which most of the time don't directly affect the central thesis of the book, and therefore they don't really detract from the point. But again, the more that happens, the less invested, I guess, I was in the thesis. In fairness, I was reading this and trying to be as fair as I possibly could, so I think he still does a good job. But again, if you're just kind of casually reading it and seeing things like this, it's going to make you tend to doubt half of what he says. Another minor point, and this one isn't, this kind of goes back to my original problem of many proverbs being treated, things that aren't proverbs being treated as proverbs. This is a related problem, but not as consistent, and it feeds into it, but it's not really the same. He'll take things out of context, and the worst example I can think of in The Return of the King, after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the herb lore master of the city of Gondor, basically, I mean, the city of Minas Tirith, says, or it may not be the herb master, it may be just the warden of the houses of healing, I forget who now, but he basically says, when he sees that Aragorn is, doing all this healing, he says it's strange that the healing hand should also wield the sword, because in his experience, the warriors do their thing and the healers do their thing, and never the twain shall mix. But of course, it's a central point of this part of the book to show that the hands of the king are the hands of a healer, and Aragorn is both. He is both a warrior and a healer. So he's saying it's strange to me that these two things would be combined in the same person. And David Rowe takes this and he kind of just takes the phrase, the healing hand should also wield the sword, out of its context and turns it into a proverb. Again, this goes back to the issue of treating things that aren't proverbs as proverbs, and I think that what happens here, but what I'm getting at is not so much that, although that is an aspect of it, but the fact that he takes it out of its context. In its context, it's clearly the person just saying, this is weird to me. But when you take out that first half, it is strange that, and then you just take the healing hand should also wield the sword, it gives it a radically different meaning. And he does this a few times. And like I said, this is just one example. So that's, again, goes back to the kind of the same issue, but it's just a different specific way that I noticed he does it a few times that I thought was just a little bit reaching. One very minor point that I noticed, and this could be the editors, whoever, finalized the text or whatever, I don't know where this mistake crept in, but it refers to Aule, who is one of the Valar, as Amaya. I don't know who made that mistake, but again, that's one of those things where if you know your Tolkien, you know Aule is a Vala, not Amaya, and so you see that in your estimation of the author's knowledge base and just your willingness to trust them just goes down a notch. Again, in fairness, it could be somebody else's fault, and that's why I don't treat it as a big deal. But it is something that, maybe if the author reads, or rather views this review, go back in the second edition and fix that, please, because it's a rather glaring error to anybody who knows their Silmarillion. So I couldn't not mention that, because it's not an opinion. This is just a clear mistake. So here is not another correction to my video, but I did actually notice another error that I think needs to be corrected in a second edition of this book, and that is in the Gondor chapter, he attributes the rhyme about Athalos to the herb master in the houses of healing, which is correct. But then later on in the Aragorn chapter, he actually attributes the same rhyme to Aragorn and says that he recites it in the houses of healing. I went back and looked at the actual text of the Return of the King, and it clearly is said by the herb master, but I can't find a place where Aragorn repeats it. I think he makes a reference to it, but I don't think he ever actually recites the rhyme. So that's another one where I think there's an error that needs to be fixed in a future edition of this book. So I just wanted to point that out since I was already doing an updated version of this video. One final point of things that I don't particularly like about the way the book was done, and again, this kind of goes back to the issue of treating things that aren't proverbs as proverbs, but in this case it has to do more with the central point and not so much with the issue itself. He treats Gandalf and Faramir, and there may be one or two others, but those are the two biggest examples, as people who are just constantly spouting proverbs. I tend to disagree, because a lot of the things that he considers proverbs, I don't think are proverbs. And again, this is way more opinion-based than fact-based, I think, than my previous points. But to me, Gandalf and Faramir are not just spouting proverbs all over the place. They do use proverbs, of course, and I think that's, rather important. But to me, what distinguishes Gandalf and Faramir is not their use of proverbs, but the fact that they themselves are wise. So they're not just spouting common nuggets of wisdom that have been passed down through the generations. They do that. Instead, what I think primarily we're supposed to see in Gandalf and Faramir is that they are themselves wise, and so things that they say will sound like proverbs, because if they gained common currency, they would in fact become common proverbs. Where you draw that line, when they're actually using proverbs and when they're actually just saying things that are wise enough to be proverbs themselves, that's a hard line to draw. And that's why I say this is way more opinion-based than my previous points, and I can't necessarily fault the author here. I just thought he went too far in the other extreme in saying that Gandalf and Faramir are, basically spouting proverbs left and right. To me, that detracts from what we're supposed to see, which is that Gandalf and Faramir, and especially Gandalf being a Maya himself and being called by Tolkien in the Silmarillion, I think, in the of the Rings of Power in the Third Age section, or maybe actually it's in the Vala Quinta, I can't remember now, but he basically says that Olorin, which is Gandalf, is the wisest of the Maiar. So, he's just that wise. So is it really surprising that he would say things that are not necessarily common currency proverbs, but which, given enough reason, could become a proverb? So this one is really kind of a matter of taste, and I think it depends on how you look at these characters. But to me, like I say, he just went a little bit too far in one extreme, where I would dial that back and say, some of these I don't think are proverbs. I think they're just expressing their own inherent wisdom they've gained over the years, not necessarily just expressing older wisdom that's been handed down through tradition. Here is not so much a correction as a clarification. He, in his list of points that he kind of took a little issue with about my original video, pointed out that he thinks that I'm wrong about Gandalf and Faramir, and that they are using proverbs. And I noted in this original video, of course, that they do use proverbs, but I just wanted to clarify here. Part of the reason that I think we can say that Faramir is not just always repeating proverbs, but is at least occasionally, and I think often, using phrases that reflect his own wisdom, not necessarily just handed down wisdom, is the fact that at least in 2 or 3 instances, and 2 of them that I can think of are really close together, he prefaces a line with "'tis said," or well, not prefaces, but follows. So, for example, he tells Frodo, "Murder will out, 'tis said." So he certainly sets off things that are common proverbs. I don't remember now off the top of my head what the other one was that he says this about, but the idea that I'm getting at is there are certain things that he says that are clearly accepted sayings in a culture, whereas there are some things that aren't. And I think a lot of those things, because he doesn't set them off with "'tis said," aren't reflective of a common saying so much as him expressing his own wisdom. So I just wanted to add that to point out this is one of the reasons that I have the opinion that I do. But again, let me express, this is my opinion. You could certainly kind of push that line either way. It really just depends on what you think are proverbs and what you don't think are proverbs. And because we never see, like 3 whole days worth of time in the daily life of a Gondorian or something, we don't really get an idea of what sayings are common currency. And the same goes with Gandalf. We don't, even in the Lord of the Rings, we don't spend enough time with him to really grasp what things that he says are just common proverbs and which ones just reflect his own wisdom. We can't know. So this is just kind of my opinion on a lot of the phrases being used seem to me more like reflections of their own wisdom rather than common currency sayings. But I could be wrong. I have no idea. You'd have to ask J.R.R. Tolkien his opinion, and we can't ask him. So anyway, that's the last thing I wanted to add to this video. Now let me talk about some of the things that I liked. So the biggest thing that I liked about this is just the general approach. I think despite all the things that I mentioned before that are flaws, I do really like the idea of taking proverbs spoken by different people within Tolkien's world and seeing how the culture of the person informs the proverbs, and also the kind of reverse angle, seeing what the proverbs that we hear can tell us about the cultures that we are, that we're coming into contact with. And that's really interesting because, of course, Tolkien is in some ways creating cultures that not only don't exist in our world, but could not exist in our world. There isn't an elvish culture in our world because the elvish culture is informed in large part by their immortality. And so it's interesting to really pay attention to what elves say and see how their huge histories have informed their own wisdom traditions, and a lot of it has to do with their immortality. And of course, if you think about it, that's actually a masterful achievement, because how do you begin to describe the wisdom tradition of a culture that could not exist in our own world? That takes some real imagination. And so, in just the chapter on the elves, I think there's actually more than one chapter on the elves, actually, because I think they kind of, or maybe sub chapters, kind of like the hobbits, because they kind of treat the Galadhrim in Lothlorien and the other elves who are the Noldor, and he kind of separates those out. And I can't remember if it's separate chapters or just sub chapters like he does the Hobbit, but looking at those and getting an idea of what it must be like to be an elf and the kinds of wisdom that you acquire by living for millennia, it gives you a new way of looking at the genius of Tolkien for figuring out, okay, I've got this race of people who lives basically forever. What kind of wisdom tradition would they have? And he does it. And you're like, wow, that's actually really cool. Not only that, that gives you a new appreciation for Tolkien, but also the general approach does a really good job of crystallizing things that you might pick up on a casual read. So you might notice, of course, differences between, the people of Gondor and the Rohirrim, but you're not necessarily on just a pleasure read picking up on the really distinct cultures, other than, of course, the Rohirrim use horses and Gondor doesn't really. I mean, those are kind of the biggest things. You do pick up on a few things, of course, because Faramir will, in his conversation with Frodo, explicitly lay out some things like, the Rohirrim tend to be more warlike and treat war as something that's kind of fun or good in itself, whereas the descendants of Numenor didn't, but are moving in that direction. So there's a cultural difference there that Faramir explicitly lays out. But you can get more of that by really paying attention to some of these proverbs. And I think that's another really useful aspect of this book, because it does really highlight we are looking at different cultures. It's not just, and this is, let me just throw in a dig at Peter Jackson's movies, in the scene where Elrond says, men are weak, they're scattered, divided, leaderless. It's like, well, they're not scattered, divided, and leaderless. They have leaders within separate cultures. Rohirrim have a king. The people of Gondor have their steward. The people of Dale have, King Bard is dead by the time the Lord of the Rings gets going, but they have a king, and before that had a master of Lake Town. So, you've got different cultures with different leaders. They're not, it's not, Peter Jackson's movies really kind of makes it look like men are just this mass group that aren't really differentiated and are divided because of that. And they're just, they don't really have anything going for them. Whereas this, book really takes the approach of, they do have separate cultures that are meaningful. Let's look at those and see how they're different, because they really are very different. And I think that's a useful tool for those of us who maybe, have picked up the Lord of the Rings once or twice and not really thought about things like that, because you can tend to overlook some of those differences. The more you read it and the more you really pay attention, the less likely you are to do that. But even me, who's read it, I can't even remember how many times now, at least 5 or 6, that I can remember, probably more. and seen the movies a bazillion times, even I can be a little bit too ready to think of men as not that different from culture to culture, whereas this book really highlights the distinctions. You know, obviously, like I said, the Rohirrim are a very horse-based culture, whereas Gondor is not. That's obvious, but beyond that, you don't really necessarily think of the differences. But when you really look at the Proverbs, you actually do get a sense beyond just those really superficial things. So I think that's a really cool thing that he does, is he makes it clear that there are these different cultures and they matter. And again, that also plays back into the point of Tolkien really is a genius, because he has to make these cultures seem distinct, and he has to do that all from the imagination of one person who has only one culture of his own. So I think in that way, this book really does a lot just to help us appreciate what Tolkien has done in creating an entire world here. So that's pretty much my thoughts on why I like the book. So at the end of the day, what would I say about this? I don't want to rate it, because I don't necessarily think ratings are that useful. But I will say I think this book definitely deserves a read. If you can get a copy, do so. In fact, I think on Twitter, if you can find David Rowe's Twitter account, he'll occasionally post like, here's how you can buy it direct from me, so you can do it that way if you want. It is on Amazon and probably all the regular sellers. But anyway, that's the, you can get the book in a number of ways. But I would definitely pick it up if you're at all interested in this sort of topic. It's also worth having in part just for the index of Proverbs, even though I disagree with a lot of his decisions in terms of what to include as Proverbs. The fact that he's got just a list of all these different Proverbs is really handy. I actually really like that, because there are so many of them, it's hard to keep track, and you want to, every now and then, you want to just be able to pull one off the top of your head. The one downside, he doesn't include anything from the Silmarillion, which admittedly there are not that many Silmarillion Proverbs, because most of the action is, at a very high level. You're not seeing a lot of conversation. It would have been nice if there was more Silmarillion Proverbs drawn in, but even so, just the ones from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings makes for a long list, even if you take out the ones I disagree with, and it's just really handy to have that list. So if you just want a list, the book is worth it for that almost, because it's got all of them. I mean, and the thing is, because he goes farther than I would in describing Proverbs, he caught all of them. So that's a good thing. At any rate, that is my take on the book. Definitely do go pick it up, unless you're not at all interested in this sort of thing, in which case, I'm sorry. So that's my take on the Proverbs of Middle-Earth by David Rowe. If you enjoyed that, please do give me a thumbs up, share the video around to other people you think might be interested in considering getting this book. And of course, you can find me on Twitter at JRRTLore, where I occasionally drop nice trivia questions related to Tolkien and his worlds. You can also, of course, subscribe to the channel here. You can patronize me at Patreon over here, and I do have a recent upload of a behind-the-scenes and Q&A video you might want to check out. And I've got previous videos up here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.